Thank you, Ryan. I'm very excited about this next session because this was really the first session that started to come together in the planning phase for this event. And I think that's because as the abundance agenda goes, housing and sort of urbanist issues have a bit of a head start on the other sectors. And so we might hear a little bit about why that is in this next conversation, but certainly we'll hear sort of where the YIMBY movement is and where it's going in the future. So please join me in welcoming to the stage the four J's: Jerusalem, Jenny, Judge, and Jennifer.
All right. Well, the only qualification for being on this panel is having a J name, so I'm glad we're doing this today. I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. My name is Jerusalem Demsis. I am a staff writer at The Atlantic, and we're going to talk about, a lot of things today, but one of the big things is that, everyone on this panel agrees with the underlying fact that one of the biggest problems facing America's housing affordability crisis is the persistent lack of supply of housing in the United States. And we've been focused on this fact for a long time, this very simple, knowable, understandable, observable fact about the world, because there's been a lot of opposition to agreeing that that is the reason why we're seeing skyrocketing rents and skyrocketing home prices, especially on the coast of the United States and in other developed nations. So given that we've gotten a lot, the YIMBY movement in particular has gone really far in making sure that this fact is understood. You see in California, you see in Oregon, you see in Washington, you see even in DC attempts to address this problem, and on the East Coast where there's a lot more opposition for various reasons, even in places like Connecticut, there's attempts to pass YIMBY legislation. There's a larger question here, right? It's not just there aren't enough housing units, it's where do those housing units need to be built? What are the various ideologies that need to accompany YIMBYism, and do any other various ideologies need to accompany YIMBYism in order for it to be successful? Given that the coalition of people who call themselves YIMBYs, they start in urban environments. These are educated individuals, and they lean urbanist for various reasons. And so for a long time, urbanism and YIMBYism have been somewhat synonymous, right? And I think there's various amounts of disagreement on this panel about the value of that, and we're going to really tangle out how much of that is necessary. Neither in my journalism nor in my paneling do I attempt to be neutral, so I'm going to lay my cards out here for you all that I think it's pretty clear that urbanism is a positive benefit both for people, for the environment, and for the economy. I think there are some really good arguments that we're going to hear today around the ways in which we should see sprawl is potentially compatible with resolving the housing affordability issue, and tangle out the environmental, the economic, the public health implications of sprawl versus density. And so I'm excited for us to have this conversation. So I'm just going to start with Jenny.
Great. I'm Jenny Schutz. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings Metro, and I have been asked to start off by laying out some of the potential climate benefits of an urbanist agenda, pro-housing agenda, and sort of making the links between them. So we can start with the facts that buildings and transportation are two of the biggest sectors emitting greenhouse gases, and housing connects to both of those things. So there are three different ways that where we build homes, what kind of homes we build, and kind of the infrastructure around them matter a lot for climate outcomes. One is bigger houses use more energy to heat and cool, right? And that's pretty straightforward. You just have more space. It requires more energy to cool it in the summer and to heat it in the winter. Also, homes that are attached that share walls require less energy than homes that are detached, right? So a 6-bedroom, single-family detached house with a yard is by definition worse for climate than a townhouse that shares walls on either side, or than an apartment in a multifamily building, right? Second thing that matters is where we're building homes, and we can think about this where they're built relative to large job centers and to retail and commercial amenities, right? And in a work-from-home environment, it's important to remember that more than half of people's daily trips are not commuting. It's stuff like going to the grocery store and the coffee shop, and pick up and drop off of kids and things like that, right? So are we building homes that are close to jobs, close to retail and amenities, so that people can get back and forth with short distances and potentially with non-car trips, right? And the third piece of that that's really important is what are the transportation systems that connect homes with job centers and the commercial and retail? So did some of you come out yesterday on the bus from downtown DC? So if you did, we sort of got the grand tour of from the urban center through the suburbs to the exurbs, and it was really, I was sitting there like taking pictures out of the window of the bus. We go from downtown DC, which has vertical buildings and where homes and jobs are often pretty close together, and they are tied together with subways, buses. DC is building out fairly extensive bike lanes, sidewalks on most of the streets. So you not only have proximity, but you have a variety of different transportation options for people to get around, right? Then we go out through the stretch of the inner suburbs where there are metro lines on the rail and some bus lines, but much farther apart, right? So when you get to the suburbs, it's much harder to do most of your daily errands without relying on a car, and the distance that you have to travel gets longer, right? Then we get out to Loudoun to the exurbs. Loudoun is building out metro rails. Loudoun's actually building quite a lot of dense housing. So if you came out yesterday, you will have seen a bunch of townhouse developments, which are pretty compact and pretty good structure types. But you have a development of townhouses, and then you've got 4 to 6 lanes of road, and then you've got a shopping center surrounded by surface parking, right? So even if you live in one of those townhomes, maybe a mile and a half from the grocery store, you probably have to get into your car and drive sort of circuitous routes in order to get to the grocery store and drive back, right? So if we were integrating housing with jobs and with retail and amenities and building out things like sidewalks and bike lanes and putting in bus service, we could reduce the amount of transportation emissions and also make people's lives a little bit easier, right? Reduce the amount of time they spend getting around doing stuff like this, right? So these are sort of the 3 basic dimensions. And I will say it's fun to come out through sort of this urban to suburban and exurban progression. The townhomes that Loudoun is building, in many cases, are allowed by right. Loudoun has actually been pretty progressive on their zoning, is encouraging lots of new housing development in diverse structure types. The townhouses that Loudoun is building are illegal to build in large parts of the district, right? The District of Columbia, which has not that much land, has made it illegal to build anything other than single-family detached homes on about half of the land, right? Why is that? Why can you not build row houses in the district that are getting built as of right in some of the suburbs, right? Arlington County is having this big debate over missing middle, right? And I just want us to remember kind of the craziness that jurisdictions with really expensive land, with really high amenities, close to jobs and transit infrastructure, make it illegal to build anything other than single-family detached homes that take up a lot of land, that are expensive for people to live in, and that have the worst impact on climate, right? So for me, those are kind of the worst offenders. The suburbs and exurbs could be doing things better, particularly sort of integrating uses, but the high-value locations that have this restrictive zoning, those are the worst offenders and the ones that we should be pushing back on.
Hi, I'm Judge Glock. I'm with the Cicero Institute, based out of Austin, Texas. So I was going to focus at least at first, about the affordability issue, and then move on to some of the environmental issues with sprawling the suburban development. Now, I wanted to start by saying that basically everyone in this room, I assume, has the same basic model about how to reduce housing costs. You reduce the amount of single-family zoning, you increase infill and densification, and you increase access to mass transit. The problem is the cities in America that actually are affordable, and we do have many of them, do none of those things. All of those things I do support and I've advocated for, but those of us in the YIMBY movement who are advocating for that have to look around and recognize, wait, what cities in America are actually affordable? The cities, if the best measure of affordability is the median house price to median income ratio. How many years of the average income in a city would it take for that person to buy a house or a condo? In most of America, that's about 3 to 1. If that's Nashville or Oklahoma City or Atlanta. And all of those cities are very single-family housing based. They have lots of single-family zoning. They have very minimal mass transit, and they have very little infill. They have about an average population per square mile ratio of about 3,000, and that's been gradually going downward over the past 70 years, from about an average of 6,000. Back in the 1960s, 6,000 people per square mile. What cities and areas have densified? Well, there's actually only one state that has densified significantly over the past 60, 70 years. That's California. California has gone in the opposite direction. Have about 4,000 people per square mile. It's up to over 6,000 people per square mile. What has happened along with that densification? You've seen a gradual increase in the housing price to median income ratio till in San Francisco, LA, San Jose, it's more like 9 or 10 to 1. Now, I'm not saying that densification is the cause of that increased housing prices. Of course, it's mainly an effect. The fact that more high-value land, as Jenny points out, leads to more demand for dense housing. But we do have to confront the fact that that's clearly that densification and that increased use of infill and multifamily housing is not reducing significantly housing prices in California or most of the other cities who rely on it. The reduced housing price in America are in those Midland cities that have continued to sprawl and continue to rely on a lot of single-family zoning and all the things many YIMBYs decry. And I would point out as well that those cities are actually very affordable on a global basis. If you look across the globe and you look at which cities have these lowest housing price to income ratio, which again both the World Bank and you and others think is probably the best measure of affordability, these cities, Oklahoma, Atlanta, Nashville, Columbus, etc., are among the most affordable on earth. There's maybe 1 or 2 Canadian cities like Edmonton or elsewhere that have close ratios. A lot of urbanist dreams like Tokyo and elsewhere are more like 7 or 8 to 1 in terms of the affordability ratio. They're incredibly unaffordable. So it's very strange to me that we have a lot of YIMBYs and urbanists who are doing things that I support, supporting densification, infill, and all these things that we absolutely need, as Jenny pointed out, but who are ignoring this massive opportunity to increase what's unfortunately titled sprawl, which actually seems to create the affordability and housing environments that most Americans want. And we know they want it because they're moving there. They're moving there. These cities like San Francisco and New York, et cetera, have increased by about 50% their population over the last 60 years. Places like Atlanta, Jacksonville, Florida, Phoenix are more like 500 to 1,000%. And also, sometimes people make some weird numbers, like, well, if you throw in some incredible high number for the cost of transportation, it's actually more expensive in Phoenix. It's not. And we know it's not because people are actually moving there and the units are actually getting built. So what can we learn from that? It doesn't mean that we don't densify. It doesn't mean that we don't advocate for more of those necessary multifamily units in areas that are clearly willing to build them and that is now illegal, as Jenny points out. But it does mean that perhaps a lot of our focus should be on those what's unfortunately titled sprawling suburban communities, where you can have, yes, single-family housing that is cheap, accessible, and affordable, and is where most Americans want to live. Now, I will just talk briefly about the environmental implications of this, because I don't disagree with, I think, anything that Jenny pointed out right here, but there are some countervailing facts that you have to be recognized. There is a broad consensus in the environmental and economic community that dense cities have some significant issues with the environment. The simplest one is the heat island effect. And as we face more global warming, that heat island effect is going to be increasingly significant. NASA just released a study that showed denser, more concrete and asphalt-based urban areas, which is what a dense urban area in America looks like by necessity, have about 5 degrees to 7 degrees higher Fahrenheit temperature than more sprawling communities. As the global environment heats up, those dense areas are going to get even hotter. And there's just no significant debate that sprawling areas are significantly lower heat index than those more dense areas. The other issue is local air pollution. Again, you will not find any significant disagreement in the research that denser cities have significantly more local air pollution, particulate matter, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, et cetera. And that's simple because you concentrate more people and whatever they're burning, even if they're burning less of something or even if they're moving slower or even moving in buses, that local air pollution is much more concentrated and people are exposed to a lot more of it. The National Bureau of Economic Research paper that just came out showed there's probably dozens of more air pollution deaths in large, dense American cities than equivalent non-dense American cities just because of the local air pollution increase. And unfortunately, that heat island effect interacts with that local air pollution. If you have more density and more heat, that exacerbates the change of nitrous oxide to ozone and other dangerous particulate and other dangerous local environmental contaminants. So we have to face that issue at all. And then finally, I'll briefly just talk about driving, because people say, well, you can't have this because there's these driving implications of sprawling suburbs. Now, the best research, the National Research Council put out a meta-survey about all of the research on density and driving, and they showed that doubling density, which has never been done in American history in any city, even in California or elsewhere, would reduce vehicle miles traveled by about 10%, 5 to 12, they said. That's something we haven't done and would reduce the amount of particulate and CO2 emissions over the next 50 years by a minuscule amount, especially when we know that driving is being increasingly electrical and hybrid based. If we're looking at redesigning our entire cities to reduce by driving by 10% 50 years hence, when we know driving is actually being increasingly green and clean, then maybe we're aiming at the wrong metric. And maybe we should be focused more about how to make these environments in the suburbs, the single-family houses, the cars, et cetera, much more green and much more amenable to the average American who does actually want to live there.
Wow, to the second. I'm Jennifer Hernandez. I'm a longtime environmental and land use lawyer in California. I spent 23 years on the California League of Conservation Voters. I grew up in a really industrial factory town outside the Bay Area and now just at the edge of the Bay Area. I have the privilege of being on the Breakthrough Board. I teach environmental justice at USC. So I kind of come with a very practitioner orientation to these events, which I always find inspiring. I am a housing warrior in this particular incarnation of my career and have admired and also collaborated for some years now with the YIMBY since their founding in trying to reverse the perception that adding people and the structures people need is bad. It's bad for the environment because it causes more people using my park or my school, more people using my road, more demands on my water or my sewage capacity, and God forbid, I just don't like new people. And that has been a dominant factor among the progressive left, the archetype for which for me has always been Marin County, where more than 80% of the county has been permanently set aside to make housing illegal, all types, in open space preservation dogma that is 100% aligned with this sort of environmental NIMBYism. In my world, our housing solutions far too often focus on whoever has the mic at the time. So if you talk to people who build 100% affordable housing and every penny is created from dollars other than theirs, and then typically those costs are not passed along to ultimate residents, we don't have a housing shortage at all. We just have an affordable housing shortage. It now costs in San Francisco roughly $1 million per apartment. We're talking typically 700 square foot or less apartments to build a new affordable housing project. $1 million per apartment in building costs, often excluding land prices. The failure, in my judgment, to take into account, for me, an archetypal union household, my dad, median income, plus or minus, 3, 4, 5 years, home ownership should be attainable. Homeowners have about 70 times more wealth than renters. It has been a ticket to the middle class ever since we created a home ownership financing structure to fight communism in the 20s and then supercharged it in the New Deal. It created the middle class from which I'm going to guess many of us sprung. To have shut that middle class pipeline of intergenerational wealth creation and home ownership down in the name of global climate change is, to me, a sin. It is evil. And I use terms like that only to get your attention because none of us are evil by definition. But a one-size-fits-all solution that says, if you ain't got it now, you ain't never gonna get it, and neither will your kids or neighbors or friends, that crosses the line to me. That's evil. And when those consequences also have very discernible color lines, that's evil. That's not a society I want to support. And I'm nervous about society. And if we don't create a pipeline where a hardworking family can still afford to buy a home, how hard should that be? In California, because they certainly can elsewhere, which is where they're all moving, then how stable is our society to make a long-term commitment to decarbonize or do anything else? Or how unstable is it, and how does that instability at best create paralysis and at worst create conflict of the type that we don't even want to think about? I think, much with energy, housing is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We have this J shape in California. If you turn California upside down and start in San Jose and draw a J down to San Francisco Marin and over to Berkeley, Oakland, we have a uniquely profitable, uber wealthy, fantastic, world-changing YIMBY community. And the solution set, when you have enough wealth to be putting up affordable housing units at $1 million a unit, when that's a tolerated circumstance, that is a wealth situation that cannot be replicated. And so the solution set, which I think is very much top of mind for the YIMBY leadership movement in California and is urgent, because that area can accommodate as many bodies as we can squeeze in. And they'll be the best and the brightest and the most fabulous, and then they'll turn 33. And then they'll want to own something or have a kid or do something else that's totally shocking. And then they'll realize that they can't make that happen at home unless we change things dramatically. So we need a change paradigm for our J. But for our L, Los Angeles, which would be the 11th largest state, LA County, if it was a county, is 4 times the size of Rhode Island. It's massive, 10 million people, all income brackets, all immigration statuses, total diversity. A solution set in the J is misplaced. And so I'm going to leave you, because this is what I do. I get apartments built in business parks in Irvine, which now has more apartments than multifamily homes, that cost $4,500 a month to rent. Fabulous, fabulous. But it's not a solution set. There are, just as we can do most anything when we set our mind to it, there are climate resilient new communities. I completely resent the concept of sprawl as a derogatory one-size-fits-all for anything not built in an existing parking lot. Please. A climate-resilient community has a central village, it has higher densities, it has surrounding higher than single-family densities, it has jobs and other mixed uses, it has some, and they're much smaller lot, much smaller structure, because face it, we have much smaller families, single family and attached unit townhomes, and that is a walkable by design community. It is not bisected by 6 lanes of highway. It has a bike path that's safe for the kids to go to school, for anyone to go shopping, for the gym, for the remote work hub. We can design and build climate resilient communities for the 3 million people we need homes for, but not in parking lots of closed Mervyn stores. So I'd like us to just be a little more open about it.
So Jennifer, I thank you for kind of creating a picture of what a suburban community that you're thinking about will look like, because I think often when people think of sprawl, that's not what they're thinking of. And actually, potentially, there's actually a lot more compatibility between an urbanist vision and what you're discussing. But we're at Ecomodernism, and so I want to start with Hurricane Ian just made landfall and then obviously devastated Florida. I think where above 70 people have died and a lot of people's property damage. I think it's the most expensive storm to have hit Florida in history. There was a recent investigation by NPR that showed that HUD would, in its attempt to increase homeownership to middle-income and lower-income families, had basically been pushing people into homeownership in places where floods were going to be more prone. And this is true not just, of course, with floods, but also if you're talking about building out into places in California, if we're talking about building out into places in exurban Phoenix, places past Chandler, and suburban exurban communities like that. These are places where there are serious climate impacts, which I think are often not internalized by homeowners at the very forefront when they're buying, because they're in search of affordability, as coastal states are not providing that. So I guess my question is how do we create in your mind this kind of homeownership opportunity and doing that in more exurban communities without saddling tons of people with the financial risk of an uninsurable property?
I think that's a terrific question too. And again, though, I think the tendency in the environmental community is to make kind of sweeping pronouncements. Let's take wildfire. So we now have a very, very, very terrible situation in forests that bear no resemblance to the forests I grew up with. They are overgrown woods, as I'd only seen before in Michigan. So we've created a major problem through the management of our forest resources. That is what it is. We've created it. It's not a hurricane, it's us. Okay, let's own it. What do? Well, we now have, I think, about the best fire code in the country. Moreover, we have fire community planning codes in the country, and we have now enough data, for better or for worse, to know that the suburbs in Santa Rosa, where I grew up, went up like flames, even though they were an established city. The largest city in that county was what burned. The newer homes that had been rebuilt in that suburb, but more importantly, the climate resilient communities that had been built to modern standards became places of either survival in the home state or in the community level state. They became the deployment and refuge areas because they are that climate resilient. And we found stuff that we didn't know, like an irrigated vineyard is a great fire break. Who knew? So we're still finding stuff, and I think we always have the humility, need to have the humility to know what we don't know, which is everything. And so we do the best we can and we muddle forward. I don't know enough about hurricanes, except that they happen all the time, it seems like, and they cause flooding when they happen. We have somewhat more regular flooding events. And I now have to do a whole sea level rise analysis and plan for sea level rise in communities I'm building. And I want you to also think about these new communities in as small as like a military base, closing military base scale that's right embedded in the community, or even, 30 acres or something like that, which is a huge amount of property in an infill community. We're having to deal with sea level rise in a sea of low-lying existing areas where it's going to be the place of refuge. So we can do better, smarter stuff, and we can regulate to assure better, smarter stuff. But what we can't do in this panel, from my perspective, is one size fits all. Here's your bike, which is going to get stolen, by the way, and that's a whole other issue. And here's your one-bedroom apartment, and go forth and spend every penny you're not spending on student loans on rent. That, to me, is not tenable.
Judge, Jenny, I kind of want to expand this to you guys. How does homeownership fit into your vision of what this future needs to look like and how YIMBYs need to interact with it? Because at some level, right, like a lot of the arguments Jennifer is making around homeownership providing that kind of security makes sense, but as we know, and I think maybe has not been brought up yet on this panel, most of the reason why people choose to live in cities is because there's massive economic benefits, both for them, for companies, and for the country at large when people agglomerate in these areas. And given that, that kind of single-family home, there's not enough room in San Francisco for every single person who wants to live there to have a single-family home. That just doesn't exist. So how do we make those trade-offs in the future? How much do we need to kind of let go of homeownership at all as the primary goal here and provide avenues for renting to become a financially feasible future, or what do you guys think about what that looks like?
Yeah, so people like being homeowners for lots of different reasons. One of them is to build wealth. And in the US, we have a whole bunch of policies, many of them written into our federal tax code, that encourage people to build wealth through homeownership, right? So the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually leveled the playing field quite a bit between owners and renters in sort of the middle to bottom part of the income distribution. And I think that was actually one of the best features of the program. But homeownership is still subsidized through the federal income tax code, right? So if you buy a home, it appreciates in value, you sell the home, most of the gains on that are not subject to capital gains tax, right? That is not true if you're putting your money into the stock market, right? So there are a bunch of ways in which we've encouraged people to think of homeownership primarily as a wealth building tool, we run into some problems when people expect to buy a home and the value of the home should go up, more than inflation. It should go up 6 to 10% a year. And then we have other people who don't yet own their first home who are trying to buy in, right? So homeownership as a means of wealth creation through prices going up is really hard to square with homeownership as just providing a place for people to live and renters trying to buy into that the first time, right? Homeownership and rentership both need to be viable. Most people in the course of their life are going to be renters for at least some chunk of time. Many people, but not all people, will be homeowners for some chunk of time. And we know that as people are living longer, we also see some transition from ownership back to rentership later in life, where people maybe don't want the maintenance requirements of taking care of a house with a yard and all that goes with that, right? So, a lot of what we're thinking about here, so the all of the above strategy, I completely agree with Jennifer that we shouldn't think of one structure type or one location type or one tenure type as right for everybody or right for everybody at all points in their life, right? We're gonna need a variety of different things. I would love to see policy move towards treating all of these options on a level playing field, right? Why do we subsidize homeownership when the tax code in ways we don't subsidize rentership? Do we have to? Why do we have preferences built into our land use code that preference building single-family detached homes and prohibit or make it difficult to build multifamily structures and denser structures? Let's just put it all on the same playing field, right? Let's have laws that don't put their thumb on you should be a homeowner versus a renter, or you should live in a single-family detached house, or you should be building in greenfields, right? Let's make all of this just equally treated under our policies, and then let the market determine, follow where people want to go. There's demand for a lot of people to live in dense urban centers close to jobs, maybe just at some point in their life, right? But we can see from the price premium, there is a lot of unmet demand for relatively small housing in high amenity locations close to jobs and transit that we're not building enough of, right? If we were building more of that, then the price gradient, the difference would look a little bit different, right? There's a fantastic article in the New York Times today about new studio apartments that are getting built in Tokyo, which is Tokyo is a big metro area. It's really dense. It's got a lot of high-paid jobs. They are building brand new studio apartments, which are 95 square feet, although they're double story, so maybe in volume they're a little bit bigger. Those are renting for $340 to $630 a month in central Tokyo, in walking distance of subway lines, right? Nowhere in the US are we building studio apartments that are building for under $600 a month in these high demand locations, right? So, Tokyo buys steel and lumber on the same global market that the US does. How is it that they can build new construction in central locations for so much less than we can? I think we should investigate that. If we were building more small apartments, all of which are, you can't build a 95 square foot apartment, right? Even in New York City, it is illegal to build something that small. We have decided that no human being is willing to live in that, although apparently, people do, and people crowd into spaces. So, I feel like we just need to have a policy that doesn't lean so heavily in the direction of one lifestyle, which at the moment is what we have, right? Let's just make things a little bit more even, and then let people have some choices.
I think I'm largely, at least in this case, with Jenny about not putting your finger on the scale about homeownership or rentership. And I think it's important to diverse that discussion from the actual shape of the built environment. There's nothing in necessity, obviously, that says a single-family home is a home ownership home, or vice versa, that multifamily can't be a condo or a co-op or something that involves some sort of ownership. The basic rule of thumb is something like 80% of multifamily is rented, and 80% of single-family housing is owned. But again, not necessarily connection. I think there's the empirical question, which ultimately I think is maybe less important, about where is the thumb on the scale and where is it pushing people right now. Again, I think the ultimate goal with Jenny and I is that you should let the market speak and allow people to live in the sort of environments they want to live in, which means a diversity of different environments. My general take is that actually most of the current policies are subsidizing densification. And I know that's a contrarian view, and a lot of you disagree with that. But if you look at things like the most famous, the interest tax deduction, the income mortgage tax deduction, you get to deduct mortgage if you're a multifamily housing taking out a mortgage to rent out to people as well. And in fact, depending on what year you built that, you might get accelerated depreciation to depreciate that capital expense quicker than you would if you got a single family home, where you don't get depreciation usually as part of your tax benefits right there. In general, again, what is forcing people to, are people choosing to live in potentially 95 square foot areas, and they being kept from that, are people potentially being kept from living in 2,600 square foot single family homes because there's urban growth boundaries, there's slope density ordinances, there's the lack of infrastructure and roads that go out to these further, more sprawling environments. I think on the whole, you see more, in fact, of the forbidding of the latter than the former.
Where's the zoning code that says you can't build a 2,600 square foot building? Who has a zoning code that prohibits that?
I think, in fact, yeah, it's a good point, and I think like part of this is an overfocus on zoning per se.
Yeah.
One of the issues, and Jennifer obviously, who deals with a lot of the different aspects of the land use law, zoning is just use and density. It's just one of many, many aspects. The stat I always bring up, you bring up 80% of Marin County, I bring up 40% of the 9-county Bay Area is grazing land. And that's largely not because they are zoned single family. They are not zoned at all. They're urban growth boundaries, they're nature reserves, they're held off of the market entirely, and people just can't grow out even if they wanted to. And then you get to the issue of mass transit versus automobiles, which again, very difficult discussion about what is subsidized. Right now, there is absolutely no debate that mass transit gets about 70% of its revenue, not from the fare box, but from the government. Cars, it's almost entirely the opposite. Depending on who you ask, on the federal level, it's definitely a net subsidy they take from your gas tax and they give to mass transit. And the whole level, if you do local environment, something like 95% of the roads are paid for through car taxes. Someone's shaking their head there. I know it's disagreement, we'll trade the studies and all the things afterwards, but nobody, I think, can disagree. You can count the externalities, but no one disagrees that mass transit is massively more subsidized than cars, just on a dollar-for-dollar basis. There's just nothing out there that's going to show that. Even New York, which is the most funded, is about 40% fare box funded.
Well, Judd, just to ask you on this point. So, I mean, we built the infrastructure for cars, like in the 60s and 70s. We did not build like an entire infrastructure for trains across the country, or?
Well, we tried to, and it depends on the sound. So the infrastructure we built for cars, which starting with the 1956 Highway Act, was paid for by a gas tax. And it was 100% paid for basically up till 2012. It was a 4-cent tax on gas. Drivers paid for the roads, starting with 1964 with the Mass Transit Act. And then 1973, with the use of gas taxes for mass transit, it's been the opposite. You've had direct grants to mass transit as opposed to road. The infrastructure was paid for both levels, but just the people in the mass transit weren't paying for it like the cars were in the whole. Now again, there's externalities to cars, and we talk about. And I think on the whole, we probably, considering some of those local pollution effects that are now being ameliorated by the greener cars, we should have been much tighter about that building in the 1950s and 1960s. But on the whole, the subsidies are just clearly going in one direction, and...
But we don't charge user fees to people who drive on most roads.
Well, we do because of the gas tax. I mean, the gas tax is the user fee that we all pay, and that's what's paying for the roads. That's the entirety of the state funding. That's about 110% of the federal funding, and as a local percentage, it's some property tax, which doesn't do the gas tax. The gas tax is paying for that use. Now, what do we do with the mass transit and the density issue right now? So I think this is kind of all a historical debate. We're talking about like what's the best policy going forward right now. We've seen an incredible collapse in mass transit over the past year and a half. We've seen about 50% down for rail, 40% down for bus traffic. Cars are about up to their same level right then. That means the average BTU cost of moving a passenger mile on a bus is significantly higher in most of America today than it is in a car. And that's going to get worse. As cars get more efficient, and as the buses continue to carry less people and tend to be more subsidized, you're going to use more and more fuel and more dirty fuel to move that same person the same distance. Now, that doesn't mean there's not an essential place for those buses, especially in these downtown areas that, like Jenny, I hope get built up. But right now, we're spending a lot of money to subsidize a few downtown transit systems that are actually carrying an above median average income. The average rider of a transit system today or a bus has a bachelor's degree.
So-
They're non-representative.
So rail and bus look really different on the
Yes,
demographics,
exactly.
right? And I think it's worth talking about that in sort of the context of work from home. Rail transit ridership collapsed and has not come anywhere back in, even in like the New Yorks and Chicago's, right? Bus transit ridership has held up much better. It dropped by less and has come back in a lot of cities, in large part because people who ride buses often do not own cars, right? So like the ownership cost of having a car is pretty high. There are people who don't own a car, who can't afford to own a car, who can't afford the maintenance and insurance on a car. Buses are a means of transportation, in many cases for a lot of the essential workers who continued working, right? So if we want our institutions to continue
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
we need to have some sort of
we again
transportation
really
system.
need to be clear on geographic differences. So pre-World War I, World War II cities that did have mass transit and were built on a denser footprint have robust bus systems. In San Francisco, for example, we have a quite robust bus system. There are a handful of lines, bus lines, elsewhere in California that have significant ridership. Overwhelmingly, bus lines are not serving even close to as many passengers as they started serving now, 20 years ago? Because ridership started to plummet, and it plummeted the most for low-income workers, who as soon as they could piece together $3 or $4 grand to buy a Toyota or Honda, started enjoying the same benefits that wealthier people take for granted. I can get to work on time. I can get home to see my kid. I can pick up my kid. I can go to the grocery store. I can go to the doctor. That car ownership issue for California is a civil rights issue. We voted to give more than 1 million undocumented immigrants driver's licenses because it was not possible to attain equity in living without having access to legal driving. It's a due process issue under the California and federal Constitution to take someone's driver's licenses away. That is not to say we want to encourage everybody to drive. That's not the point. But my point is, please keep in mind those essential workers who have absolutely no transit option in the foreseeable future, for whom we've already figured out, glory, a lower emission, cleaner rideshare option is a much more efficient, much more highly utilized form of transit for someone without a car than getting on 3 buses and hoping for the best. Our technology is
I just want us to be comparative here a little bit because I think that we're getting a little bit in the weeds on specific topics. So it is clearly the case that there are trade-offs that everyone has mentioned between the kind of suburban, car-oriented. Obviously, what you guys are looking for is not, the worst version of that. You're looking for clean cars for our more walkable communities, and then the denser kind of vision that we're talking about over here. And I think, my larger question here is when we're talking about what types of which of these things can, which of the trade-offs can be solved for with technology, I think that's a place where we're maybe not spending enough time on. Because when it comes to buses, for instance, right, the fact that what you mentioned is there's not reliability, that's a solvable thing with algorithms with enough time and effort placed to actually invest in bus systems. You can solve that with technology. You can also solve, we see this in other countries, right? We see in other countries. We also solve problems in suburban environments, right? You can solve issues around the fact that these places are often not accessible via foot or via bus and bike. You can solve that with technology that we already have, and that's what we've talked a lot about the abundance agenda here. So I think the question is, given that many people, when you look at land prices, want to live in these dense areas very close to downtowns, why would we not spend more of our time and energy trying to solve the insufficient bus systems, bike systems, all these different things, rather than just say okay, well, let's take it as a given that all of this stuff is always going to be bad, even though there are countries all over the world with much less resources than we have.
Because I think the main reason is because the marginal new bus line or rail line added now has basically a passenger seat ratio of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, and every new line or every new bus we add, it gets worse.
I think it's weird to use the numbers during COVID, right? 500 people are
No, I'm
dying a day
talking,
right now.
sorry, 2019. It's, again, now we're talking bus lines, even though they haven't collapsed as much as rail, as Jenny pointed out. It was down about 40, now up to about 30% still down. Down significantly, which is in fact, of course, down just part of the same trend that has been going on for 70 plus years. 1960 was about 12% of people took transit to work. It got down to 5% and stayed pretty steady and then dropped again during the crisis. And that ignores non-work trips, which have dropped almost to nil on transit. And as Jenny points out, the vast majority of trips are in fact non-work trips. We do need that, and hopefully as we densify, we're going to get more of those downtown walkable areas with some of those buses. But on the whole, the future, especially the climatological future, is going to be in green cars because they are simply much more efficient. The average transit commute, forget again commute, which is the main thing people optimize for when they're buying housing and looking for this, is about 45 minutes in America. It's about 20 minutes on a car. And that's across countries too. If you look at who has the quickest commute, it is always going to be by car because of the last mile problem, and you can never have a bus that shows up every 5 minutes like a car can show up every 20 seconds when you want to walk out to it. Now again, and if we're talking about what is using less BTU per passenger mile traveled, which is getting more clean quicker, and which is going greener and more electric, it's the cars. And so exactly like you, I think if this is the way the entire trajectory of US transportation has been moving for the past 60 years, and which is accelerating now, and if the subsidies to the mass transit keep going up or the number of passengers drive keep going down, and the environmental costs of buses is going up and trains are going up just as long as the environmental cost of cars go down, well then we should put most, not all, definitely we should work on those buses too, of our energy and environmental resources into making that car as green as possible.
Also, I mean, it's not just technology, it is cost, right? So each bus line, a full 8-hour bus shift with a fully maintained bus, and then 4 or 5 of those buses on each line in order to get the headways and the evening and weekend coverage you need, that's a many $million-dollar bus line. And so at some point, someone says, is that the best way we can spend our money? Are we providing the kind of service people need with that amount of money? Maybe we can triple it and see if that works. Well, we sort of experimented with that too, and it hasn't worked. The fact is, people don't like having to jump on 2 or 3 different buses, as just one example, or spend twice as long as they'd need to spend if they could walk, bike, or take a car. Any of those. Time is important to people. So when you start factoring in, okay, we've got a market telling us that this bus is not very popular, then let's just drop the bus line because no one's riding it. Okay, except there's 4 people who are transit dependent who are riding it. Now, I still think you have to solve for their transit dependence, but I don't think it's a bus.
I mean,
I
people
think
hate
it's a
congestion
rideshare.
too, though, so I want to let Jenny get in here, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to wrap this back a little bit around to housing affordability. So I completely agree with you that a lot of low-wage workers depend on cars to get around, and it's a combination of things, right? So one is that the bus service is really unreliable, right? I take the bus to work, I'm on one of the main lines in DC, and it's still not that reliable, right? It's supposed to come maybe every 15 to 20 minutes during rush hour, and it doesn't, right? So like, there's a real cost, and if you have a job where you have to be at work on time, or you get docked pay, or you get fired, it is really important to get there, right? To me, the lesson is not, we should get rid of buses and get everybody cars, we should run buses more frequently, right? And the buses, many of the buses on the main lines are in fact crowded and overcrowded. And I will say, I'm not primarily a transportation person. There are a bunch of questions transportation systems have to deal with, including they're trying to hire more bus and train drivers than they can't because they can't hire enough people. So like, this is a complicated problem that's beyond sort of my ability to solve. But circling back around to the housing affordability, in a lot of metro areas, low-wage workers everywhere live where they can afford housing. In a lot of the high-cost cities, low-wage workers wind up living in places that have terrible transit service because those are the places that are cheap, right? So if you look at the DC Metro, you've got a lot of low-wage workers who are living in, sort of right around the Beltway, where you get on the Beltway in Montgomery County, who are living in the outer regions of Fairfax and Montgomery County, who are living all the way down 95, close to Richmond, because that's where housing is inexpensive, right? So they can live there, but once you get there, there is virtually no transit, and so then you have to have a car, right? If we build more cheap housing in places that already had transit systems, then more low-wage workers could live there. I will say there are a bunch of low-wage jobs that are probably always going to need cars, right? So landscapers and housekeepers and childcare providers, their location of work moves frequently, and so for them, a car is probably going to be essential, right? Again, to the no one-size-fits-all, there are going to be people at lots of different places on the income spectrum who will take transit or who will drive cars if both of those are reliable and affordable within their budget. There are people with lots of different incomes who would choose to live in central locations or suburban locations, right? We at this point don't have enough of the housing in transit accessible locations. Every major metro area that has a good transit system has a whole bunch of stations that have like nothing around it, right? That have like one-story homes or one-story commercial or parking lots. We have really underutilized land close to transit systems. We have transit systems that don't have a lot of riders because people can't live within walking distance of the transit systems, right? And markets would fix that if we didn't have stupid inflexible rules that prevented them from doing it. The transportation subsidies are another issue, but like the land markets will work if we allow them to work.
And just to second Jenny's point there, I mean, I think like I talked about how the anti-sprawling ordinances and laws are pushing people out of the suburbs. There are plenty of those laws that Jenny pointed out that are pushing that class of people who want to be downtown and be transit out of the cities where they obviously would have a much better quality of life. And we're definitely on the same page about trying to ameliorate and reduce those sort of barriers for people living that life. But the last thing I will say on this, and this is just not because I'm anti-density, because actually, in fact, for my entire life, I've only lived in the central downtown business district, basically, of every city I've lived in, and I do like those areas, most certainly. But we have to deal with trade-offs and costs here. And we know the taller you build, the more expensive things get. That is just a basic fact of physics. When you go from about 2 stories to 4 stories, the cost per square foot goes up by about 1/4. When you go from 5 stories to 10 stories, now you're talking about a half increase in square foot. Because you need more and stronger materials to go upwards. You usually need concrete and steel instead of wood or even mass timber, which can work on a much lower level. That cost is going up. So again, if we're worried about affordability, it's good to allow more of that dense housing downtown. And that's going to be slightly costlier to build than a far out suburban home on just a wood frame house and so forth. But there's lots of people who want to live there. But in terms of, we're just talking about raw affordability, and frankly, to some extent, environmental impact, because those more materials use more CO2 and greenhouse gases to build, we're going to have to weigh those costs and benefits, or ideally, let the people weigh that themselves, get the laws out of the way, and I'm one of those romantic souls that still hopes for a carbon tax, and let people internalize that cost of the carbon they're using.
So, land value tax.
So we just have a
couple, that too, absolutely.
So we just have a couple minutes before we're going to be doing Q&A, but I kind of want to get just like short from each person. There's a lot of different kinds of disagreements that we've had on the stage here, but it seems like there's quite a bit of agreement on the deregulatory need around housing, zoning rules, other types of construction laws that are making it difficult to build affordable housing. Given that it seems that people are in agreement that that's kind of the way to go, what role do you see for the government in engaging in and pushing for either this more suburban oriented development or urban oriented development and densification? And because is this just like a fun little thought experiment we're all having here, and that the market's just going to rip, it's going to go where it wants to go, or is there something that we want to direct it towards?
So I'd like to start just by saying that California has a quite top-down level of mandatory planning for growth. It's called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Each city and county every 8 years is told it has to accommodate X number of new housing units. Where the housing units get accommodated in that city or county is left to the city or county's discretion. And for many cycles, they're called of 8 years, cities and counties have not been accountable for actually approving the housing that's in the plans. With the help of the YIMBYs, the leadership of the YIMBYs, that has now changed, and cities are having to approve what they planned for. And that is, to me, a quite nice get out of the way government plus stay in the way government solution. Top down, you have to allow housing. Bottom up, decide where and how in your town of whatever scale. And there has to be equitable distribution. The idea is not rich people can exclude all new housing. That to me is a good idea. California filed, different people in California challenged just under 48,000 housing units in 2020 using our version of NEPA, alleging that this, God forbid, new housing caused any number of environmental catastrophes. Each one of those sued projects gets stalled for 2, 3, 4 years, sometimes for 10. Every stall means housing delayed, housing denied, and when the housing comes back, if it comes back at a higher price point. Environmental law should not be applied at the project level. Look at the plan for infrastructure. projects in the plan, whatever the plan is, and that plan went through NEPA or the equivalent, we need to not allow chipping away at every project. It's the simplest to me and most equitable, one size fits all, because you can't just have housing. You also need schools and parks and pipes for water, not for gas. So that to me is the common denominator solution.
And I would just say that I think Jenny and Jennifer and I have disagreed about which of those burdens are the worst or most damaging, but I think the important fact that we all agree on is that all of them are damaging, all of them prevent the sort of housing they have, and ideally we allow people to select for their preferences and live in the sort of environment they want without the government being in the way of these sorts of decisions. And the very last thing I think I want to say is just not to underestimate the general success of American housing. We tend to look at the failures on the coast and in a few cities and forget that America on the whole has created some of the most affordable housing, some of the most successful growing cities on earth. And some of those may not look like I want them to look or how we like them to look, but we should actually celebrate some of that success and recognize it as we're opening our minds to being housing agnostic about what people are going to choose in the future.
So I will agree with that, and I will say we should celebrate the diversity of cities in America. People have different preferences over kind of overall city environment. We should celebrate a diversity of housing choices in structure types and tenure and price range. If we legalize a diverse range of structures in most residential neighborhoods and allow the market to sort out what to build, and looping back into one of the conversations from this morning about permitting reform, please, dear God, let's figure out a way to write down straightforward rules for building housing and then let stuff get built by right, moving away from this litigious, discretionary, project by project case. You can challenge it based on 1,000 different underlying laws. Like, just write the rules and then let people build housing, make it faster and easier to build rather than every single project being a battle with the existing neighbors.
What is Jennifer going to do for a job, though?
Retire. I can't until it's fixed. What are you going to do?
All right, put Jennifer out of a job 2022. Okay. So questions, I think we have Alex and Ted with mics.
Lots of questions. All right, let's start here.
Lots of questions here.
Yes, since e-cars have come along, I mean, it sounds like cars are still supposed to be bad. So I would like to hear, it seems like, okay, a lot of you guys are from the coasts, and in the interior, the climate could be like minus 20 or 30. So there's issues about waiting for the bus, or 110, either way, depending on where you live. Why are cars still bad? That would be my question.
And like this morning, we'll take a few questions, and then
Okay,
you can pick and choose who you respond to.
Going now? Yeah. So I subscribe to the housing theory of everything, as it's now called. I've called myself a housing truther for years, where the idea that housing is tied to nearly every problem that we have in contemporary America, where that's the racial wealth gap, or declining economic growth and dynamism, or just the fact that people literally don't move as much as they used to. Millennials think that they're jumping all over the place, but they actually move from the county that they were born in at far lower rates than their parents or grandparents did. And so I'm curious, just your thoughts about how densification and our success or lack of success at densifying kind of our big superstar cities, how does that affect these other issues in society? And are the second order effects there as impactful even perhaps as the first order effects?
I'd love to ask about Prop 13, which is unique to California. When you buy a house in California, your taxes stop at that rate, and you get to pay the same tax rate the rest of your life. So I've been a homeowner in San Francisco and now in LA, and a lot of my neighbors are bought their houses in the 70s, have lived there a long time with very low taxes, making it really unaffordable for my peers to be able to buy houses as well. I'm interested in your take, particularly Jennifer, on to what extent is Prop 13 the root cause of some of the housing affordability issues in California in particular, and then what should we do about it? Should we overturn it? Should we do something else?
Yes.
Well,
we can have a whole other session on that, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Prop 13 is a little bit of a California wormhole. And from my perspective, the biggest part of the Prop 13 catastrophe is the fact that 2 years later, the legislature locked in exactly what percentage of property taxes, all property taxes stay in the county that the tax is paid in, but there was a lock-in in the 70s of which agencies in each county got how much of that money, whether it was the mosquito abatement district or county mental health or whatever. And those have been politically immovable allocations ever since. So the newer cities that weren't around, or the cities called contract cities in LA that contracted with the fire department in the county instead of having their own fire department, they are locked out of access to their fair share of their own property taxes. And that has had a really corrosive effect on the quality of public service that is available in California communities, and has made us all quite cranky about the fact that we have existing deteriorated conditions no matter how much we're paying. And when you're cranky about existing deteriorated conditions, the last thing you want to do is invite more people to the party. And so that NIMBYism that is so rooted in some of California's tax financing is, from my perspective, a later legislative sin that was a not necessary but clear outgrowth of 13, and they both need to be reformed. Cars are evil because people we don't like use traffic we want, traffic capacity we want. To sell a transportation bond in California to someone who will never realize the benefit of being on a train, because we now take 30 years to deliver a transit project. Through your entire lifetime, you're going to be paying for a bond that you voted to approve and never get to use. To sell it, the way the pollsters tell us we need to do it is other people will ride that transit and make room for your car.
It's the old Onion headline that 95% of Americans agree that other people should take transit, which is still true. And yeah, to the question about the cars, I say that often kind of the animus against cars is a solution desperately looking for a problem. It changes. Like back in the 1970s and 80s, it was a local air pollution problem. If you look at ICE-T, the 1991 transportation bill, they were giving out grants to cities to reduce driving as part of meeting their local air quality attainment. That's not an issue now because thankfully, because of EPA regulations, the pollutants, the air pipe pollutants are down 99% per mile from these cars, the 6 major pollutants. We've really improved it, and so now it's got to be something else. It's climate. Well, there's electric cars that can be hooked up to the grid. Well, it might be something to do with communities change. I think we just have to recognize that this is what most people clearly want to drive. And again, we should make them internalize the cost, but there's just obvious and ample benefits to cars that people refuse to recognize for some reason. And on the no, go ahead.
And the idea we're going to go to a century-plus-old technology, the bus, as a solution, as opposed to say, Zoom and remote work. Again, we're just caught in yesterday's.
Even
in rural areas, even with lower income essential workers, they're driving less.
The issue of how much of a problem cars are depends a lot on the underlying population density, right? In most parts of the U.S. where population is not that dense, like rush hour traffic is not that bad, right? So cars are not that much of an imposition. I mean, there's still pollution involved, right? Local air quality still does matter. But if you think about the dense cities, right? Think about Manhattan if everybody who works in Manhattan tries to drive, right? There are these great graphs circulating on Twitter that show like the amount of space per commuter for a car, right? A single occupancy vehicle versus the number of people you can fit on a bus or the number of people who can use a bike lane, right? So if you have a lot of people who are trying to get to the same location, cars are just spatially very inefficient to transport a lot of people in the same place in the same time. This is not an issue in lots of cities, right? So I don't think anybody is actually saying we should get rid of cars in like middle America where there's a ton of space and not that much congestion. On the other hand, like not having everybody in Manhattan or San Francisco or DC drive to work during rush hour seems to me like a pretty sensible proposal.
Yeah,
so California is saying throughout California you must reduce vehicle miles traveled by 1/3 throughout California. And most of California is like most of the country, and that's a laughable proposition.
And as I've written about, this is doubly ironic. California says you have to reduce VMT for every new thing, even though the average household in California uses a half less greenhouse gas emissions per year than the average household outside. Every time they're forbidding one of those sprawling projects for using too much VMT, they're actually confining someone else. I shouldn't say consigning or confining, because I'm in Texas now, but they're consigning someone else to Texas, where the weather is not as good, admittedly.
And where we don't care about greenhouse
and we don't
gas.
care about it. So that's
We don't
really a
count
net
it.
negative.
They're gone.
Yeah,
It's like
they're
the
gone.
drought, you know? My
Let them
son's
go
not
back.
taking a shower. I've
Yeah.
saved water. Excellent. He's
Yeah.
moved to Texas.
And the one thing I'd say, exactly, you all get the benefit of that now. The one other thing I'd say about that, and I won't want to, we almost agreed beforehand we weren't going to go to Prop 13, but I would say that the general issue to me is we haven't faced is why do most of the cities in America work? Even though they have these zoning rules, they don't have all these things. It's because the incentives are right. Because the incentives, you collect the local, there are cost congestion. We can't deny it. We can't pretend new housing imposes zero cost on nearby residents. But as an old, I think it was a Fremont Times paper said in 1966, cows don't pay taxes. That's why they built back in the day, because they said, that guy's not paying taxes. You build a new development, that increases our schools, that reduces the rest of our property taxes. You get the incentives right, and you actually need a lot less of this imposition of telling people where and how they should mandate building.
I didn't think transit would be the big hot topic of this. The last thing I'll say on cars too is, of course, if you could push a button and give everyone an electric car and also electrify the grid with enough kind of clean energy, like that would be one thing. But that's not really the way that it's going to work. So I think obviously everyone here is saying that we want to move towards clean cars and electric vehicles. But on the way there, it's going to require some people to be on transit, especially in these dense places that Jenny brought up. So more questions.
To equalize the tax treatment of homeownership and renting, should we tax imputed rent on homeowners?
Yes, if we can figure out how to do it and explain it to voters.
So
Very succinct answer. Get another couple questions.
Jordan McGillis, Manhattan Institute. Jennifer, this is mainly for you. I tend to be skeptical of the home ownership as a vehicle to wealth accumulation in the absence of the supply constraints. Would it be that vehicle to wealth if not for the restrictions on new building?
And one more question back here.
Hi, this is Paul Williams. I think a question I have is just what, in general, the panel thinks about how these effects play out over 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, right? Like people talk about we need to increase the amount of housing. And some people say, oh, well, the price didn't go down. They built a big new building and the price didn't go down yet, right? And I think, how long do we think it takes for these impacts to happen is one thing. And then another way to kind of frame that is, how do we think about the elasticities of supply of housing in cities? Because a lot of times when we see price changes, right? Like the rent inflation that we've seen recently is huge influxes of new demand going to these like southern cities, right? Like Austin, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, all kinds of people move in. Nobody could have predicted that would happen. And so you see these price spikes. Those cities happen to be places where a lot of new supply is able to come online to absorb some of those price impacts. And so, how do we think about these over longer time scales and business cycles and like unpredictable changes in demand and people moving?
So maybe I'll take the home ownership dual questions first. I really want you all to please go far enough back in your family history or to your elementary school classes or whatever to think about a union household. Earning median income. It doesn't have to be union, but earning median income. That household can afford about $2,000, $2,500 in California median income land on housing, if you use the normal sort of metrics. Every month that amount of money, call it $2,000, is sent to a landlord, is money gone. Now, it's not gone. You get the benefit of living somewhere. That's great. But if you have a mortgage, over a period of time, that $2,000 turns into equity, which is greater equity, which is how both my Mexican and Sicilian grandmothers with reverse mortgages managed to not be impoverished as elderly long-term widows. They drew on that equity. And that's simply not an available tool in a rental circumstance, having nothing to do with tax policy levers that this town is obsessed with. Fine, I mostly am not here, I'm fine with that. The equity piece also finances college. It takes care of some injury, illness, joblessness periods that almost everybody goes through. And people always come back and say, oh, you know, if you put that $2,000 in the stock market instead. And I'm like, what $2,000? You don't have an extra $2,000. You have $2,000, a third of your income, for housing. And then you have to spend the rest of what you earn for everything else. I'm wonderfully happy for those who can pay $2,000 in rent and invest $2,000 in the stock market. But that's not America for most people. America for most people, homeownership for most people, is wealth accumulation that comes from a forced savings plan. And we make it better, no question, with tax policy. And we make it much better with various insurance for mortgages and other stuff. And with standard setting. You know, we make sure through inspections and whatnot that people who buy homes at least have some level of structural integrity that they're buying into, or they're not going to get a mortgage. But it really is the buffer plus the savings plan for most people who can afford to get into the market in the first place. And that's why homeowners do have 70 times more equity. US Census, more wealth than renters, even accounting for differences in income and other demographics. So I just don't think nobody voted to get rid of home ownership for climate or any other purpose. And we are rocking the foundations of our country if we remove housing security and wealth accumulation from the majority of our citizens.
All right, well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but there were a lot of great questions, and I'm sure you can accost the panelists after this. Thank you.